Hey, this is Virginia, and my project is on genetically modified foods. Before this class, I was slightly uncomfortable with the idea of tinkering with nature to create genetically modified foods, but not in a way that made me want to avoid eating GMOs or buying them at the grocery store. I became especially interested in GMOs this semester while I was reading Stolen Harvest. Vandana Shiva was very critical of GMOs, but I found many of her justifications in the book were not supported by scientific evidence. And as a future science teacher, I am very interested in scientific evidence. I don't want my students to fall prey to unsubstantiated claims when they are out there in the real world trying to make decisions. So, as I started researching GMOs, I came across a whole lot of unsubstantiated or downright false claims about GMOs. I've researched a lot of controversial issues in my life, and I've never seen this degree of misinformation and widespread use of fear tactics used by leftist activists. I had a really difficult time finding opponents of GMOs who founded their opposition upon sound scientific research or used articulate philosophical justifications. For this reason, I started engaging actual people in conversations about GMOs. I was specifically interested in their reasoning for opposing GMOs. A lot of people were opposed to GMOs for reasons that weren't actually factually accurate. Some people thought that if a farmer planted plants that were not genetically modified in his fields, and a neighboring farmer planted genetically modified foods, and the pollen from the genetically modified crops blew into the not genetically modified crops and pollinated those plants, the farmer who was not trying to grow genetically modified foods, but whose plants were cross-pollinated unintentionally, would be sued by Monsanto because Monsanto owns patents on all of these Monsanto owns some of the patents on these genetically modified foods. And so those crops are in a sense property of Monsanto, and you have to buy those seeds from Monsanto every year. And if you're growing those foods without paying Monsanto for that permission, then you can be taken to court for copyright infringement. But if you're not doing that intentionally and it's just pollen blowing in the wind, Monsanto has never taken any farmer to court for unintentional pollination. Other people thought that GMO seeds were sterile, and one person told me that they don't trust a organism that doesn't produce seed. Well, actually, GMOs they do produce seeds. And lots of foods that aren't GMOs don't produce seeds. Some people cited a study that said that GMOs caused cancer in rats. This was an Italian study, and that study has been critiqued because its methods and interpretations of the data were not scientifically sound. So, although they had heard of a scientific study, they didn't know the details of that scientific study or know that the scientific community has, in essence, rejected that study. So, I was still looking for good reasons to resist GMOs. I should explain that when I say I'm looking for good reasons, my intention in this project is not to be unbiased. I'm biased as a scientist, as a left-leaning person, as a former employee of a regulatory agency. I'm searching for information that appeals to me. And through my conversations with dozens of people, I did find some particularly interesting reasons that people resist GMOs. These categories were potential human health effects, environmental sustainability, tinkering with nature, and compromised food sovereignty. So, potentially human health effects. Um, every single GM food goes through a rigorous approval process by the FDA. And I tend to trust this process, although there are reasons that people shouldn't trust this process. Lots of regulatory agencies in the United States are swayed by industry, and when people told me that they didn't trust the regulatory agencies, I had to go back and think about my own work as a health inspector and think about the ways in which the health department does not always act in the very best interest of the public, because they're also being pulled in another direction by industry. And then there was that study showing cancer in rats, and people are right to be concerned about a scientific study that shows cancer in rats from eating GM foods, but we have to look at that study in context. And there are hundreds of other studies that show no issues in organisms who consume GMOs, and in a sense, we, the people and the livestock who live in North and South America, are a giant experiment, because we are eating these foods. We are the guinea pigs, but we aren't sicker as a result of doing so. The last thing in potential human health effects is the problem that there are no long-term studies, so we don't really know what the future holds. The next category is environmental unsustainability. And GM crops are altered so that they are resistant to a chemical called Roundup, which is sprayed all over the fields, and it kills everything in the fields except for the crop. And that, is a potent chemical that kills plants and can be harmful to life on Earth. There's also the issue that genetically modified foods are planted as monocrops, which limits biodiversity and makes all of these crops susceptible to pests that come along. They could potentially wipe out lots of food sources on our planet, because the food isn't varied in its genetic makeup. Also, the production and application of all of these pesticides and fertilizers uses a lot of energy. It releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. The alternative is growing foods organically, but organic foods and crops don't have as high yield as GM crops. So we have to think about this in terms of trade-offs. If we go an organic route, our food is less affordable, we have less high yields, and we have to think about, what price are we willing to pay. The next category is tinkering with nature. People were really uncomfortable with the idea of tinkering with nature, which is something that I was also uncomfortable with, and I'm still somewhat uncomfortable with. I did not know that farmers already tinkered with nature quite a bit before GM foods came about. They used selective breeding, hybridization, and grafting to alter plants, and now we just do those things in a lab, and instead of inserting, getting the desirable genes in the plant through a natural process, we can splice those genes out of any organism, including animals and bacteria, and splice them into the genetic makeup of a plant. So that's interesting. And the final category is compromised food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the right of people to define their own food systems. The people who produce, distribute, and consume the food should be at the center of decisions about food systems and policies rather than markets and corporations. And this is something that resonates with me. You can see this graph on the right shows the consolidation of seed industries, and 5 companies own the vast majority and control the vast majority of the seed sources in the world. And there's also an issue of the pollen blowing from field to field. So even if you make a conscious decision not to eat GM foods, you may still be eating them unintentionally because you can't stop pollen from blowing in the wind. So I'm just over 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop now. Thanks.